Thank you very much, Firas, for this kind introduction. And thank you also, Professor Hirschler, for the invitation to talk here tonight. And thank you all for joining today's session. I was very, very thrilled when I read the introduction to this lecture series about manuscripts and violence, for I think that this is a very big aspect, actually, of material culture, and it is not often enough talked about when we think about manuscripts and manuscript movements. As I think if our aim is to understand history, we need to understand what impact the destruction of material culture, and with it, of course, also the loss of the immaterial value has on its societies. We need to be aware of how huge the gaps are in our map of history due to such disruptive acts of violence and destruction. And as we all now know, the violence has not stopped until today, and destruction of cultural heritage is still taking place in many parts of the world, which I think is all the more reasons to raise the awareness for it. So for my part, today I will speak about the story of the libraries in Tunis during Hafsid rule, which is from the mid-13th century to the end of the 16th. It is a very complex and multi-layered story. It is astonishing how little we know about the book culture of Tunis under Hafsid rule, although the city was a global center of teaching and learning from the 13th to 16th century. What I will try to do in the next 40 minutes is first to explain why we know so little about the libraries of Hafsid Tunis. And without spoiling too much, I can already say that it is for the most part because the libraries and books were looted, lost, and forgotten. Secondly, I will summarize a few aspects about Hafsid book culture that emerge when all the recovered pieces are put back together. But of course, a survey of Hafsid book culture will also reveal many, many things that we do not know and things that are lost to us. So I will try to start the presentation. Yes, perfect. In 1785, the German Orientalist Johann Heinrich Weppler described the collection of Arabic manuscripts in Kassel. He introduced his description by saying that ancient manuscripts are important to us not only because of their content, but also because of the language and the characters that they are copied in. Accordingly, his description of a seemingly North African manuscript, which you see here, deals with the Mauritanic characters and their divergence from the what he calls common Arabic script. His assumption that this manuscript was copied in North Africa was not solely based on the Maghribi or Mauritanic calligraphy. On the flyleaf of the codex, a former owner of the manuscript had written, and I quote in English translation, I, Johannes Marquart of Königsegg, Freiherr, etc., took this book when the most serene ruler and Lord Charles, the fifth Roman emperor, set off to Africa, where he had conquered and taken plundering the capital of the barbaric land called Tunis, and I took it with me as a souvenir. And this happened in the year 1535, after Christ our Saviour's birth, in the evening of Maria Magdalena, which was on the 21st of July. From this manuscript note, we learn that the manuscript was taken as war booty during the sack of Tunis by European armies in 1535. Commenting on this event 250 years later, the German Orientalist in Kassel, Weppler, regretfully wrote, and I quote, regarding the content, we could only wish that since this gentleman had occasion to do so, of the many books that were then destroyed in Tunis, he had saved another one, actually useful for historiography, because this codex contains only a portion of the Qur'an. Clearly, the story of the lost libraries of Hafsid Tunis after the sack of the city was still known in 18th century Germany when Weppler was cataloguing the Kassel collection. With this knowledge, the word saved is of course a euphemism given the destructive nature of any looting and the fact that Johann Marquart of Königsegg was part of it. I am going to give a little excursus on the sack of Tunis in order to contextualize the looting of the libraries. At the beginning of the 16th century, two imperial powers faced each other. In the west, there was Charles V, who ruled as King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor, and as such he had territories of a greater part of Europe under his thrones. Meanwhile, in the east, the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman I was extending his territories far into Asia Minor, as well as expanding the western borders of his empire. By 1534, the Ottoman corsairs had conquered most of the central Maghrib, from where they led raids along the coasts of Europe. The most feared among them was Khayr ad-Din, who in the service of the Ottoman Sultan had conquered Tunis in 1534. At that time, the ruler of Tunis was the Hafsid Mulay Hassan, who was then deprived of his power by Khayr ad-Din. In 1535, Charles V decided to no longer risk that North Africa fell entirely into the hands of the Ottomans, and he assembled an impressive alliance for a military expedition to Tunis. And thousands of men from all over Europe took off from Barcelona in May 1535 and set sail towards North Africa. Tunis would then become the site of a proxy war between Charles V and Suleiman I. And this should just very briefly give you an idea of the dimensions and forces involved. After weeks of siege, Tunis was conquered by the Europeans without much resistance on July 21st, 1535. Khayr ad-Din was forced out of the city, from where he fled to Algeria, while the Hafsid Mulay Hassan was reinstalled on the throne as a vassal to Charles V. And as was common to pay the soldiers, Tunis was left to a 3-day sack, where thousands of inhabitants were killed or taken as slaves, and the city was looted. According to the reports on the sack regarding the war booty, the soldiers were interested in booty of more immediate material value, such as gold, jewelry, or also slaves. None of the accounts specifically mentions books as booty. Of all the eyewitness accounts that I have studied, only 4 mention libraries in the city of Tunis, and of those, only 2 speak of their destruction. One is the report of Antoine Perenin, who had gone on the Tunis expedition as Charles V's secretary. Perenin's report is the only one to record that not only the houses of Tunis were plundered, but also the mosques. In his journal of the expedition, he wrote, and I quote, "And in the mosques and temples, the armies destroyed and broke libraries and books, of which there were many about their law, beautifully gilded, bound and written in letters of gold and blue. Also, from some of these mosques, they took columns of grey jasper and other valuable stones." The most famous and most often cited account on the looting of Tunis is a paragraph in the Historiarium Sui Temporis by the Italian chronicler Paolo Giovio. Giovio had interviewed participants of the Tunis expedition upon their return to Italy, when he was invited to dine with the emperor's entourage, and he actually must have had a chance to talk to Charles V himself. And Giovio reports, and I quote, "In the sack of the citadel, Mulay Hassan, the Hafsid ruler of Tunis at that time, he regretted 3 incomparable losses. First of all, some Arabic books that were destroyed when the library was sacked and pillaged. The library held very ancient codices, not only guides to all the sciences, but also deeds of all the kings before him and the superstitions of Muhammad, which the king gladly would have bought back if it had been possible for the price of a whole town." And interestingly, Giovio's 16th century chronicle is the source on the sack of Tunis that has come down in European historiography. And this is also the book that, for example, Wepler in 18th century Kassel refers to when he speaks about the destruction of Tunis libraries. Unfortunately, there are no surviving eyewitness accounts that report on the sack of Tunis from the Tunisian angle, which would be, of course, crucial in order to reconstruct a more complete picture. The closest Arabic source to the time of the sack is a late 17th century chronicle. Ibn Abdina composed his compendium on the history of Ifriqiya between 1681 and 1698. And according to him, the looting of the libraries of Tunis by Christian soldiers did not take place during the sack of 1535, but during a second European invasion at the very end of Hafsid rule. After the Ottomans had taken Tunis again in 1569, Don Juan of Austria recaptured the city for a brief period in 1573, before it then again fell under lasting Ottoman rule in 1574. So we see that there's a back and forth between European and Ottoman rule in Tunis in the 16th century. And Ibn Abdina reports on the sack of Tunis libraries during the rule of the last Hafsid ruler, Mulay Muhammad. And I quote, "And during these days, the great mosque was desecrated and its libraries ransacked. The teachings of the schools were put to shame by the feet of the unbelievers, and their scholarly collections were scattered. And they were scattered in the streets so that the passerby in the east of the mosque, where Navarin is today, could not walk without stepping on books. And the bells were struck at the same time." And this report by Ibn Abdina is the source that has come down in Arabic scholarship, which mostly dates the sack of Hafsid libraries to the conquest of 1573. This is actually what you can also read in the manuscript catalogue of the early 20th century of the library in Tunis of the Bibliothèque Nationale, where the author says that due to the sack of 1573, only a handful of books of the Hafsid period has survived. From all the material that I have found in European libraries, more evidence points to a dissolution of the libraries in 1535. But as we will see further on, it is not that simple. I think that rather the libraries were scattered on a series of occasions, all in course of this time of war and uncertainty in Tunis in the 16th century. So maybe it is not even important at this point to put a date on the final loss of the libraries. But for what I have come across in my research is that the sack of Tunis in 1535 was the pivotal point of Hafsid book culture. And maybe more dramatic speaking, was the beginning of the end. Where the written sources are unclear about the destruction of Hafsid libraries and the dissolution of their collections, the story can be complemented by many manuscripts in European and also Ottoman collections. In the manuscript collection of Hurtado de Mendoza, who went on the Tunis expedition as Charles' interpreter for Arabic, I have found a Qur'an manuscript with an endowment certificate of the Zaytuna Mosque, from where he must have taken it. Girolamo Zeripando, a cardinal in 16th century Italy, owned a 30-volume Mus'haf, of which I have found 20 volumes in his library in Naples and 3 more in Florence. And my theory is that a member of the Tunis expedition, maybe even Charles V himself, who admired Zeripando, donated the manuscript to the cardinal when they came back from Tunis to Italy. And this manuscript was actually endowed to the Zawiat Arus in Tunis. It has also an endowment certificate. Then I have found another Hafsid Qur'an in the collection of the scholar Andreas Marsius, who passed it on to the famous Dutch Orientalists after him, such as Joseph Scaliger. Again, an endowment certificate reveals that the manuscript must have been taken from the mosque in Bizerte, a harbor town near Tunis. A manuscript that was endowed to the Great Mosque of Annaba was taken by Jacques de Ligne and is now in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. And I have added a last example of a Hafsid manuscript from the Royal Library in Tunis that was incorporated into the library of Suleiman I, as the Ottoman seal on the first page reveals. And these are only but a few examples. In total, I was able to identify around 120 Hafsid manuscripts, and they all allow for different conclusions. First, they show that not only the libraries in Tunis were looted, but also libraries along the coast of Ifriqiya. On the map, these are the little green stars. And the path that the manuscripts took in Europe reveal a lot about the networks of collectors and scholars in early modern Europe, and also the Ottoman Empire. And then finally, the reconstructed corpus can also be used for paleographic and codicological studies, like calligraphy, ornaments, inks, bindings, paper, etc., which I have done for my PhD. But what I want to show today is what evidence these manuscripts give about the spaces that they were used in, namely the libraries of Hafsid Ifriqiya. And I want to share selected case studies with you. And here you see a map of medieval Tunis. And I have colored the library spaces. In purple and pink, the suggested royal khizana or library. In the Bardo Palace, outside the city walls. And in the Kasbah inside the Medina with the adjacent Kasbah Mosque and its library. The Kasbah Mosque is here in yellow. Then in blue, we have the Zawiyat Arus, from where we have seen the manuscript that is now in the collection of the Italian cardinal. And this is actually the only evidence for a Zawiya library that we have. Then in red, I have colored some madrasas, and of course there were many, many more, but these are the ones where evidence of the library has survived. And as institutions of learning, madrasas by their very nature had books available for their students. And although the teaching activities of the Hafsid madrasas are well attested, not much is known about their libraries. And in fact, only 2 manuscripts are known to have been endowed to Hafsid madrasas. The best known Hafsid libraries are those ones held in the Zaytuna Mosque, the main mosque of Tunis, which is here colored in green. This is due to multiple factors. Firstly, the Zaytuna is the most prominent building of Tunis with a history that reaches back to the 1st Hijri century. The Hafsids initiated various expansions and restorations to the mosque, such as the addition of the ablution room and the installation of a hydraulic system. It was also the place where the Hafsids pronounced themselves caliphs and thus declared their independence from the Almohads. The location was therefore of great importance to the city and its rulers. And the library of the Zaytuna Mosque is actually the first case study that I want to share. Contemporary Arabic sources are quite clear about the 3 successive royal library endowments to the Zaytuna Mosque. In 1419, the Sultan Abu Faris Abdelaziz established a library in a maqsura, which is a secluded chamber, adjacent to the courtyard in the northwestern corner of the Zaytuna Mosque. According to Arabic sources, he donated all the books from his palace library and added more books on theology, lexicography, philology, medicine, history, adab, and other subjects. However, there are no books that can be ascribed with certainty to this collection. Abu Faris' successor then, Abu Amr Uthman, founded a second library in the Zaytuna in 1451, in a chamber adjacent to the southeastern corner of the prayer hall. His donation supposedly included books on diverse religious sciences, medicine, lexicography, history, and arithmetic. And I have found one example with an endowment certificate of this foundation. The 3rd Hafsid Sultan to build a library in the Zaytuna was Abdullah Muhammad, in a maqsura situated in the northeastern corner of the mosque. Abdullah's library gave the name to the Abdaliya collection, which is today held in the Bibliothèque Nationale de Tunisie. But after the pillage of the Zaytuna in the 16th century, as well as further removals and additions during the Ottoman period, not much is left of its original Hafsid holdings, and I could only find 3 manuscripts in the Abdaliya collection which are datable to the Hafsid period. It is not transmitted in the sources when exactly this 3rd library was established. However, a group of 4 endowment certificates suggests that their respective manuscripts formed part of the original corpus donated by the Sultan. As they state in their endowment certificates that they were endowed to the new maqsura established in the east of the Zaytuna. And they all date from the last day of the month of Ramadan in the year 1495, which led me to conclude that the Sultan Abdullah Muhammad founded his library on that occasion. And the foundation might have been accompanied by a celebration or a ceremony that involved book donations during the holy month. And to show you what these endowment certificates look like, we will look at one from a manuscript of this 1495 foundation in a bit more detail. And this is actually a manuscript from a Marinid prince in Morocco that somehow got into the possession of the Hafsid ruler in Tunis. In total, 60 endowment certificates could be identified from Hafsid institutions. And the endowment or tahbis certificates are usually copied on the recto side of the first folio of a manuscript. The tahbis statement is not repeated on other folios within the manuscript, as was the practice, for example, in other Maghribi book cultures. And the practice of writing the endowment statement only once in a manuscript, and what is more on its front page, which is a very fragile place, makes these certificates vulnerable to loss and fading. And we have to assume that many of them have been lost, removed, or have become unrecognizable, and therefore that other manuscripts can no longer be identified as Hafsid endowments. While it is surprising that there is no standard formula for the endowment notes, a common pattern can still be identified across all certificates. And I will just very briefly introduce the pattern with the example of this donation of 1495. This is the endowment certificate up here. I will use the laser pointer. This is the endowment certificate that we will look in more detail. The certificate starts with the Hamdallah. The Hamdallah can be enhanced by the addition of the Basmala and or the Tasliya. However, in most instances, the formula that serves an introduction is kept very, very brief. Here's Hamdallah. The verb from the root habasa indicates the act of endowing. And the root habasa is the common indication for an endowment in Al-Andalus and the Maghrib, as opposed to waqafa in the Maghrib. In this respect, the Hafsid endowment certificates inscribe themselves in the Maghribi tradition of book endowments. There is something like a window in front of my screen, so I cannot really point the laser pointer, but I'm trying to. Here you can see the verb habasa. Or in this case, hubisa. Sometimes the benefactor, muhabbis, is named, and in half of our examples can be identified as the Sultan himself. And I actually have prepared a list with all these points. Yes, you can see here an Amr al-Maqam, and this gives sometimes the name of the Sultan, sometimes it just says it's a royal endowment. Then blessings on the muhabbis can follow. Then the muhabbis, the endowed object, is usually named. This is a very rare case where it isn't named, but it sometimes says this Qur'an or this hadith manuscript or book. Then it goes on. The beneficiary then is indicated by ala, and this is always a nice pointer if you want to decipher these endowment certificates, to look for ala, and then you will find the place where it is endowed to. Here it is the Maqsuda al-Jadida. This is the new Maqsuda that I've talked about, which is built in the east of the Jamia al-Adam, the great mosque in Tunis. Then sometimes the use and conditions of this endowment are stated. And while some conditions or terms might be given, such as the recitation of the manuscripts on certain occasions or the permission to copy it, the donor's spiritual reward is almost never mentioned. I put it here because it sometimes is, and you would expect it, but yeah, in most cases it isn't there. And then similarly, and maybe related to it, the perpetual nature of the endowment is not noted explicitly, except in 4 examples of all the certificates. And quotations from the Qur'an, which one might expect to complement the endowment, do not occur at all. And then reference is made to a main deed of endowment, and it is conceivable that more detailed instructions and legal contexts were given in separate endowment deeds. Reference is regularly made to conditions that are noted elsewhere. Yes, exactly. Sorry, there's something in front of my screen. It's hard for me to point it out. Yeah, so in these longer endowment deeds, they must have been stored separately from the manuscripts. So unfortunately, no such documents have survived or yet been discovered. And these short notes in the manuscripts are therefore the only evidence that we have presently available. Then the date is given, usually introduced by either bitarikh or mu'arrakh, and this is always also a nice pointer to look out for. You can see it here, bitarikh. And in this case, you have Ama, Tis'amia, which is 900, which is 1495. And then in rare instances, the Nazir, which is the supervisor of the library, is named. But he always puts, even if he's not named, he always puts his signature under the endowment. And sometimes there's also another or 2 other witnesses to the endowment. And this is the material that we have to work with in order to reconstruct these stories. So these are the manuscripts that share the same endowment certificate of 1495 and are assumed to be the accompanying manuscripts to the Library Foundation of Abdullah Muhammad. I just want to briefly draw your attention to the curious fact that all of these manuscripts are foreign to Hafsid Ifriqiya, actually. The manuscript to the right is the Marinid manuscript from Morocco. The small square manuscript is a Qur'an from Al-Andalus. And this manuscript specifically was endowed by the Sultan to be recited daily in the Zaytuna Mosque, which I think is a very interesting fact. It stresses the importance and appreciation of Andalusian manuscript traditions in Hafsid, Tunis. And the third manuscript is actually a Mamluk copy of the Sahih of Bukhari. And then the fourth manuscript, we do not know where it was copied. It might as well be an Ifriqi production, but I have not seen anything similar in the corpus of Hafsid manuscripts. And without having time to go into too much details, this assembly very well represents the variety of Hafsid library stocks. So the second case study that I want to introduce evolves around the mystery of the Hafsid Royal Library. The Kasbah in the Medina is the fortress or citadel and also residence of the rulers of Tunis. The Kasbah Mosque was commissioned by the founder of the Hafsid dynasty, Abu Zakaria Yahya, in 1230, shortly after he declared his independence from the Almohads. This is the earliest known Hafsid Qur'an copied on paper. It is probably the most famous one from the period, since it is the one of the few Hafsid manuscripts identified so far. I call it the Red Qur'an. It is a small codex copied in silver ink on paper, dyed in shades of dark red, although some folios are brownish or purple. The silver ink elegantly contrasts with the red surface, and then the surah footers, actually no headings, but footers are copied in chrysography in gold ink. The manuscript was bequeathed to the Kasbah Mosque of Tunis in 1405 by the Sultan Abu Faris Abdelaziz, as the endowment certificate in the first volume reveals. The manuscript was most probably produced for the occasion of Abu Faris' endowment, although some ornamental details, here like this one, resemble 12th century Andalusi manuscripts, the script with deliberate pacing and balance is a derivation of 14th century Hafsid bookhands. So the manuscript is the only one known to have come from the Qasba Mosque library. There's also another way to connect manuscripts to the Royal Library, and it is the dedication to the patron of a manuscript, usually copied on the recto of the first folio in a splendid chrysography or gold calligraphy. This example is dedicated to the Hafsid ruler Mulay Muhammad Abdallah al-Mustansir, for whose khizana or library the manuscript was copied. It's a copy of al-Baizara, it's a treaty on falconry. It survived the looting of the libraries and stayed in Tunis. And in 1840, it was endowed with the Ahmadiyya collection that was founded by the then Ottoman Bey of Tunis, Ahmed Pasha Bey. And this is his endowment seal. The dedication to the royal khizana does not specify anything about the whereabouts of the library space, whether it was situated in the palace or also stored in the Qasba Mosque. However, there's no endowment statement detectable other than the one from the 19th century, the Ottoman one. And this goes for other dedications to a royal patron as well. There's never an endowment to the Qasba Mosque alongside it. So we can assume that these are two different library spaces, one in the mosque and one in the palace. This is an example of a royal manuscript from the late 15th century. The manuscript was copied by a certain Tunisi in 1461 and is in line with a group of about 30 manuscripts from the late 15th century, Afriqiya. It is a multi-volume copy of Esh-Shifa of Qadi Iyad, of which 3 volumes could be found in Istanbul and 1 in Baltimore. One of the volumes in Istanbul bears a colophon, which gives the date of production of 1461, which the scholars in Baltimore didn't know about. So the volume in Baltimore was catalogued as an 18th century Maghribi manuscript. So it was misdated by about 300 years. The seal of the Library of Suleiman I was probably overlooked. But this misdating also reveals how little is known about Maghribi manuscript production, and it is quite misconceived and generalized as conservative and little innovative from the 13th century onwards. And this leads to a lot of misdating of these manuscripts. Yeah. But yeah, we come back to the Hafsid libraries. From the 15th century onwards, the Hafsid elite built residences in the countryside, which served as a recreational area for the Sultan and his entourage. The Bardo Palace, a Hafsid residency outside the city walls of the Medina of Tunis, for example, is attested for the first time in a written source of 1420 and had replaced the Qasba as a main residence for the Sultan by the beginning of the 16th century. So it is conceivable that the Sultan, when he moved his household from the Qasba to the Bardo Palace, that he also moved his library. But when that was and which holdings that encompassed, we do not know. So I asked myself, where was the royal collection when the libraries in Tunis were ransacked? And from the beginning of my talk, we remember the report from Jovio, who speaks of a lost library in the citadel of Tunis. And the Latin original is Arc. And this most probably refers to a fort, which is quite literally, again, the Qasba. So I assumed that Jovio was talking about the Qasba library. But he actually does not specify whether his account refers to the library in the Qasba Mosque or in a palace space. The remains of Mulay Hassan's library are recorded again in the 17th century in a correspondence between the two Italian physicians, Giovanni Pagni and Francesco Redi, so in a quite unexpected place. Pagni had traveled to North Africa, then part of the Ottoman Empire, in order to offer his services to the Ottoman Bey of Tunis. And in return, he was allowed to choose gifts from the Bey's collection to be sent to his friend Redi and his patron Ferdinando II de' Medici in Florence. And Pani and the Bey of Tunis discuss what gifts would be appropriate to be sent to Italy. And I just want to quote from one of Pani's letters. And I quote, this is the Dey of Tunis speaking. I want to send Francesco Redi some gifts, but what could I send him that would be worthy of him and of me and worthy of the most serene Grand Duke? And this is Pani, I replied to His Excellency that if he had sent to you, illustrious, which is Redi in Italy, some of those manuscript books, which I had seen in one of his rooms in his palace in Tunis, that certainly you, illustrious, would have appreciated them. When we returned in the evening to Tunis, he immediately called Sidi Mustafa of Bizerte and told him to choose 40 pieces of books for you, illustrious, and he told me to assist Sidi Mustafa. But I do not understand Arabic nor Persian, so he chose 18 pieces of Greek manuscript books and 22 of Arabic character at random. And in a letter from the following day, he actually specifies what collection or library these manuscripts came from. And I quote again, I know how much I am obliged to you, my illustrious friend. I would therefore like you to appreciate the gift that I am sending you of some Greek and Arabic manuscripts, which are a remnant of the ancient library of the king Muleas. And this correspondence revealed several things. First, the remnants of the Hafsid royal libraries were held at the Bardo Palace. It is unclear, however, whether it was moved there by the Ottomans or already by the Hafsids themselves. And I added here again the picture of this Baysara copy with the dedication to the Hafsid Sultan and the 19th century Ottoman endowment. And I think that it might have survived in the Pasha's library at the Bardo Palace, because it's still stored in Tunis. Pani's letter also reveals that the library of Mulay Hassan was still known by name in 1667, more than 100 years after its destruction. Its fame, however, did not protect it from further disruption. On the contrary, the collection was even more exposed to further distribution. And additionally, the fact that Pani chose 22 Arabic books at random to be sent to Italy makes it even more impossible to trace them. And then to conclude, I want to come back to Königseg's manuscript that the Professor Wepler described in Kassel. And some of you might have already noticed that there's something quite off with the manuscript. Even Wepler had noticed the strikingly good condition of this ancient codex. And this is actually because the original manuscript is in the Vadiana Library in St. Gall, and Jan Loop has only quite recently made the connection between these two manuscripts. The one in Kassel is a facsimile copy of the St. Gall manuscript made by the Swiss scholar Johann Heinrich Hottinger. It seems that the administrator of the St. Gall library had provided Hottinger with 2 Arabic prototypes, one in Maghribi script, which was the Königsegg Qur'an, and then one in Kufi characters. Hottinger had received the manuscripts with the initial request to decipher their content, and this was particularly necessary for the Kufi letters, since they were still a mystery to Arabists of Hottinger's time. And while this marks the beginning of the quest to understand Kufi and the development of Nasri scripts, the copying of the Maghribi hand conversely represents one of the last examples of the appreciation of the script for a very long time. VadSlg Ms take is particularly interesting to me since he states himself that ancient manuscripts are important to us not only because of their content, but also because of the language and the characters that they are copied in. And maybe it is not very fair to call Wepler out like this on his misdating of the Kassel manuscript, because he did not have any reference material to compare it to. But he serves me as an example of how symptomatic this instance is for the phenomenon of Maghribi manuscript studies. And many of them are wrongly catalogued in libraries because there's only so little knowledge about them. And I think that all of us who work a lot in libraries, we know that a book that is displaced on a wrong shelf or miscatalogued, if it even is catalogued, is as good as lost. And the looting and scattered distribution of Hafsid manuscripts, of course, amounts to the destruction of Hafsid libraries. But the trope of the lost book culture has manifested itself in European and Arabic historiography and has additionally prevented these manuscripts from being rediscovered, and as no one went out looking for them. So I hope by collecting as many manuscripts as possible and by reconstructing a corpus of Hafsid manuscripts that we can build a reference corpus that will help to identify even more forgotten Hafsid manuscripts, and eventually by being then able to specify certain developments to better understand Maghribi book culture more broadly. Thank you.